It is a fascinating thing that during a pandemic, we're even talking about filling director jobs of museums that in fact have been, if not closed, certainly more idle than they'd like, having to really spend money to create a safe environment and not able to engage the public in the way that they used to. In fact, often only engaging 25% of the public at a time. The pandemic and social justice accountability created an era for museums in which suddenly museum leadership had to assess, and I'm talking about board and museum director, if they were ready to make the kinds of changes that would be required to meet this new era, which is an era in which safety and interactivity digitally was going to often replace the experience of being at the museum in person and touching things. So were they going to invest in the leadership necessary and the resources necessary to put safety and a digital world as a priority? And secondly, were they going to invest in the awareness needed to make sure that their artwork, that their staff, that their board, that their community interaction highlighted social justice, equity, inclusion, and accessibility? And interestingly enough, what that created in the museum world was a real assessment on the part of leadership, and I'm talking about board leadership and directors, if they in fact were ready to do the hard work that was going to be required. And I'm happy to say that most museums have met the challenge. But ironically, many directors have decided it was time for them to step down in many cases and for them to usher in a new generation of leader. I think that the museum leader has evolved from an academic art history major who knows art and can curate really interesting exhibits to a business leader who can embrace all aspects of a nonprofit mission and a for-profit business, because in fact, museums have to be run in a very financially accountable way in which they are sustainable and they are building a financial future, which means an endowment and campaigns to secure that future. So it's not just someone who can curate now, it's someone who has real financial acumen, great fundraising skills, someone who is in any way an extrovert or an introvert that overcompensates by being more extroverted, because many museum leaders are not extroverts. Yeah. They're introverts that are great leaders and overcompensating as great communicators. Museums used to be much more elitist organizations in which those with wealth admired the collections of art of others of wealth. That is no longer relevant because a community is not going to support that. What a museum now has to prove is its relevance to the community. So it has added layers of education programs, which require a lot of outreach to the families in the community, the parents, the students, the teachers. In addition, museums have become places where social gatherings often happen. So a lot of museums are renting out their facilities to social gatherings, to festivals, to
Right.
weddings. The other thing is museums have become community forums for discussion about issues that are relevant to the community. So the leader, in essence, has to be so many things. They have to have strength in so many ways that we really are recruiting for a Superman and Superwoman.
Yeah, that was what it appeared to me. And the good news is they sometimes exist.
The good news is they do exist. Of course, some have more strength in one area than the other. Right now, the strengths that I think are important are a real savvy in terms of external communications.
Yeah.
Not only your board and your collectors, but community members, educators, artists, government officials, really and truly all walks of society, because you really want to involve them in the life of the museum. And the question is, what leader and their family would consider a move to this, semi-rural, but I would say very sophisticated. The duality of Easton to me is very sophisticated, but semi-rural. One could say pastoral area. And I think that the good news is that I think this is the time when people are considering leaving crowded cities. There are certain people that interview well in this sort of setting.
Right.
But they are people that, for whatever reason, are not the candidates that are needed. They are not the leaders that are needed for that particular organization. They actually interview well, but they are not good cultural fits. And let me give you an example. They are people who, in fact, are going from having a staff of 20 at a larger museum to a smaller museum, a higher leadership position, but with a very small staff that requires them to be much more hands-on, work in the trenches, do a lot of things themselves. That often is a very bad fit. Because people that are used to having lots of staff and delegating are often not the people that easily fit into a culture in which it's all hands on deck. So that's one of the simple mistakes that goes on. The other is, I call it the cultural fit mistake. Someone who is coming from a place where the cultural communication at their organization or in their area of the country is so different than the cultural communication at the new organization or in that area of the country. And there is just not a fit. But you can see why certain searches go south. Then there is the opposite, where the board has not been transparent. And perhaps the previous director was hiding some things. First of all, I think Ben Simons has really created an environment there that is welcoming, happy, constructive, understands the balance between tradition and modernism, understands the place that the museum occupies in its large community. He was working very, very hard to make sure staff were mentored, and the staff is, one of the things that's going to be hard to find is someone who works with staff, board, and the community so well that there is not a bad word said about them. I always say, if there's a bad word said about you, you must be doing something right. With Ben, he did everything right, and there's not a bad word said about him.